Hey, what's up, everybody? Steve Schwartz here from LSAT Unplugged with some big news for you from the law school admissions world that just came out yesterday. Before I get into it, please do me a favor, like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really does help, and I really do appreciate it. So anyway, what's the big news? Yesterday, Yale Law School announced it was pulling out of the US News rankings, and Harvard followed them a few hours later. Since then, many schools have issued statements of support and suggested they are considering the same. UC Berkeley has actually also since pulled out. In other words, these schools are saying that they've decided to stop submitting data to US News about their admitted students in protest of the rankings. Yale has been the top-ranked law school in the rankings for the past 3 decades. So why would they lead the charge to pull out suddenly? Yale has posted a statement on its website, which I'll link below, where they call the rankings methodology flawed and suggested it leads schools to heavily emphasize LSAT scores and GPAs in who they admit, which in turn incentivizes schools to give students large merit scholarships to buy better rankings. It's worth noting here that Harvard and Yale are the only 2 law schools that do not give any merit-based financial aid, but instead give aid only based on financial need. Merit-based financial aid essentially involves schools offering students with strong applications significant scholarship money in an attempt to convince the student to attend their school. This helps the school boost their own LSAT and GPA medians, which helps them in the rankings, and the student gets to go to law school at a discount or even for free. In contrast, need-based financial aid is purely on the basis of the student's financial background and does not consider the strength of the application when deciding the amount to award. Yale and Harvard also criticized how the rankings count public interest jobs and fellowships. But regardless, the rankings have been mainly the same for decades. Why would top-ranked schools suddenly choose to pull out now? After all, US News can still rank any law school without their permission based on their students' LSAT scores and GPAs, since this information is easily accessible from ABA 509 reports. As an aside, I should mention that some information US News considers, like per-student expenditures, is not publicly accessible, but this is probably not nearly as important to your average law school applicant. And US News can use a placeholder for this variable. Anyway, everyone already knows that Harvard and Yale are top law schools, so those schools don't really need to worry about a potential slight dip in the rankings, and they can afford to let their LSAT scores and GPA medians drop a bit without seeing a significant drop in the number of applicants they receive. And Yale and Harvard didn't necessarily need to make a lot of noise about the rankings. They could have simply made changes to their admissions criteria without saying anything. They're clearly looking to make a statement and create some waves. Both of these schools in particular have enormous endowments. They don't need to keep raising their tuition by so much every single year. They could very easily make tuition free if they wanted to for quite a while. And Yale has, in fact, funded over 50 full tuition scholarships for students from low-income backgrounds. And I applaud them for that. Now, here's the core of what I think is really going on. In his public statement, the Dean of Admissions at Harvard Law references how the rankings perversely incentivize schools against socioeconomic diversity by encouraging them to offer merit-based financial aid, again, to help those schools raise their LSAT and GPA medians, because there's a finite pool of money available for financial aid. By encouraging merit-based aid, the US News rankings reduce need-based aid, and Yale and Harvard are at a relative disadvantage due to their policies in that they are the only 2 schools that don't offer merit-based aid. Of course, they're both doing perfectly fine in the rankings despite this, and they were already free to offer merit-based aid if they wanted to. If other schools offered purely need-based aid as well, and didn't need to offer merit-based aid to get a boost in the rankings because they didn't care about the rankings anymore, they could take on more students from low-income backgrounds, hence increasing socioeconomic diversity of their classes. Now, here's the big thing. There's a big Supreme Court case about affirmative action that will be decided by June 2023. And that case is, of course, strictly about the use of racial and ethnic diversity as factors in admissions. The fact that this case will be decided next year and will likely ban the use of affirmative action in higher education could explain the timing of these announcements right now at the end of 2022. US News weighs LSAT and GPA 20% in its rankings, the largest single factor above all others when you consider those two combined. Yale and Harvard are signaling that they don't agree with how US News conducts its rankings, and they are signaling a reduction in the extent to which they will weigh LSAT and GPA relative to other factors in admissions. Of course, admissions is truly a bit of a black box. Who can say exactly why any single applicant was admitted or denied? But they are suggesting that they will change their admissions criteria to move away from a heavy focus on LSAT and GPA in advance of the Supreme Court decision coming from the conservative court next year, which is expected to ban the use of a race-based affirmative action. So this will enable these law schools to preserve the racial and ethnic diversity of their student bodies without explicitly appearing to use affirmative action as the basis for admitting these students. Currently, the law school admissions process is primarily about LSAT scores and GPAs, with so-called soft factors like essays playing a more minor role. Given the significant disparities in LSAT scores and GPAs between members of different racial and ethnic groups, along with a heavy emphasis on LSAT and GPA in admissions, affirmative action is currently the main thing preserving this kind of diversity in top-ranked law schools. Without it, law schools would quickly become less diverse very quickly. All of this gets me thinking that their pulling out of the rankings is just a pretext or a cover for changing their admissions criteria to move away from such a heavy focus on numbers towards more soft factors. This will give them a justification to use more subjective criteria like essays, rec letters, and resumes to admit underrepresented minorities without making it obvious that they're giving that student a boost on the basis of their race. What does all of this mean for admissions? It suggests that if and when, almost certainly when, the Supreme Court bans the use of race-based affirmative action next year, students from underrepresented minority groups will still be able to get a boost from subjective or soft application factors like essays, rec letters, and resumes. At schools that are vocal about changing how they weigh various factors prior to the decision coming out, because they can't make it too obvious, they need to make it clear they are de-emphasizing LSAT and GPA, at least in some cases, and make a lot more noise about holistic admissions processes so they are not perceived to be violating the court's decision. In other words, affirmative action will likely still carry on at the schools that are pulling out of the US News rankings, just not under that name. While I'm only currently aware of these three schools, Yale, Harvard, and Berkeley, at the time I'm recording this episode, other schools have voiced support for them and have not yet indicated whether they will follow or not. I suspect many will. Now, how does all of this affect you as the applicant? I say the following without making any value judgments or expressing any opinions. I'm just stating my analysis of what's going on and how I think this will affect things going forward. My predictions. If you are a member of an underrepresented minority group who was worried about a potential end to affirmative action, this is good news for your admissions chances. You can expect that more schools will come up with clever ways to get around the upcoming ban on affirmative action. If you are not a member of an underrepresented minority group, there may be even more emphasis on your LSAT score and GPA than before. Why? Because schools will be de-emphasizing those numbers for members of the underrepresented minority groups, so they will be looking to non-URM applicants to make it up. And for those wondering, underrepresented minorities are typically considered to be African American, Hispanic, and Native American or Indigenous applicants. Anyway, folks, this was a lot longer than I expected it to be. I hope you found this helpful. Please leave any questions or comments below this video, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really does help, and I really do appreciate it. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.